I always believed a wedding day was supposed to be about love, respect, and starting a life together. I kept telling myself that the tension during planning was normal. Decisions were made without asking me. My opinions were brushed aside, and whenever I tried to speak up, I was told to relax and enjoy the moment. I wanted to believe that once the day arrived, everything would finally fall into place. The morning of the wedding felt heavy in a way I couldn't explain. People were rushing around me, talking over me, changing things I hadn't agreed to. I smiled through it, convincing myself it was just stress. When the ceremony started, I focused on the vows and felt a brief sense of hope. For a moment, I truly believed this was the beginning of something good. After the ceremony, everyone moved toward the reception. Guests were guided to their tables, laughing and celebrating. That's when I noticed no one seemed to know where I was supposed to sit. I stood there awkwardly, assuming it was a simple mistake. Minutes passed. People stared. Whispers followed me as I waited with nowhere to go. Eventually, I was directed to a table at the back of the room. There was no name card. An empty chair sat beside me like an afterthought. I laughed nervously and asked again, certain it had to be wrong. I was told I was overreacting and making a scene. That's when it hit me. This wasn't an accident. On my own wedding day, I wasn't being included. I was being pushed aside. I sat there trying to convince myself I could get through the night quietly. I told myself it was just seating, just one uncomfortable moment. But as the reception continued, it became impossible to ignore what was happening. Speeches began, and instead of warmth or celebration, the words felt sharp. Jokes were made at my expense. Stories were shared that painted me as difficult. Overly sensitive, someone who didn't quite fit. People laughed easily like this was harmless entertainment. I smiled because I didn't know what else to do. My body stayed still while my mind raced. I kept waiting for someone to step in, to redirect the moment, to notice how wrong this felt. No one did. Phones were lifted to record reactions, and I realized my discomfort had become part of the show. When dinner was served, plates were placed in front of guests at the main tables. Servers moved efficiently, one by one, while conversation and laughter filled the room. When they reached the back, they stopped. I waited, assuming it was a delay. Instead, I was told I could eat later once everyone else had been served. That single sentence made everything painfully clear. The empty chair beside me, the lack of a place card, the jokes, the waiting, none of it was accidental. I wasn't forgotten. I was being sidelined on purpose. I looked around the room and saw how comfortable everyone else was with it. No one seemed confused. No one looked concerned. It felt like an unspoken agreement had been made, and I was the only one who hadn't been informed. Sitting there, I felt smaller than I ever had before. Not angry yet, just exposed, like I was being told without words, exactly where I stood. I sat there for a few more moments, staring at the tablecloth in front of me, trying to steady my breathing. The room felt louder than before, every laugh sharper, every glance heavier. I realized that staying silent wasn't protecting the peace anymore. It was only teaching everyone how far they could push me. I thought about standing up and saying something, but I already knew how that would end. I would be told I was emotional, that it was just a joke, that I was ruining the mood. I had heard those words too many times before. So instead, I chose quiet. I stood up slowly. The movement caught attention. A few conversations paused. I picked up the gift I had brought, my hands steady even though my chest felt tight. I didn't look toward the front tables. I didn't wait for permission. I simply turned and started walking toward the exit. That's when the reactions began. Someone called out my name sharply. Another voice accused me of being dramatic. I was told to sit down, to stop embarrassing everyone, to think about how this looked. None of the voices asked what had happened. None of them asked why I was leaving. As I walked farther away, the words followed me, growing louder and angrier. I heard someone say I was ruining the night. Someone else said I always made things difficult. Those comments didn't stop me. They only confirmed what I already knew. When I stepped outside, the noise cut off suddenly. The air felt cool and real, like I had been holding my breath for hours without realizing it. I stood there alone, still dressed for a celebration that no longer existed for me, and let the truth sink in. Walking away wasn't impulsive. It was the first decision that had truly been mine all day. I stayed outside longer than I expected. At first, I just stood there, listening to my own breathing, trying to slow my thoughts. Then I sat down, still in my wedding clothes, surrounded by silence instead of music and laughter. The contrast felt unreal, like I had stepped out of one life and into another without warning. The shock faded, and the weight of everything I'd been holding back finally hit me. I replayed the day in my mind, not just the reception, but the months leading up to it. Every time my concerns were dismissed, every time I was told to let things go for the sake of peace, I realized how often I had been asked to shrink myself so others could stay comfortable. I cried then, quietly, not because I was alone outside, but because I finally understood what that day represented. It wasn't just about a seat or a speech. It was about respect and how little of it I had been given. A wedding is supposed to be the moment where two people stand as equals. What I experienced was the opposite. Sitting there, I imagined what staying would have meant. More moments where my feelings were treated as inconvenient. More situations where I was expected to absorb disrespect and call it compromise. That thought hurt more than leaving ever could. I checked my phone for the first time since walking out. Notifications were already appearing. Missed calls, messages stacking up. I didn't open any of them yet. I wasn't ready to hear excuses or blame. I needed to sit with the truth before anyone tried to rewrite it for me. For the first time that day, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The humiliation had stripped away every excuse I'd been making. What remained was honesty, even if it hurt. When I finally opened my phone, the messages came all at once. Some were angry, accusing me of ruining everything. Others were softer, but just as dismissive, calling what happened a misunderstanding, telling me I should have stayed and talked it out. A few suggested I apologize, not because I had done something wrong, but because it would make things easier for everyone else. Not one message asked how I was feeling. I noticed how carefully the words were chosen. People spoke about the embarrassment I caused, the awkwardness of my exit, the way it looked to guests. No one mentioned the empty chair. No one acknowledged the jokes or being told to eat later. It was as if those details didn't matter, or worse, as if they never happened. The more I read, the more familiar it felt. This wasn't new behavior. This was the same pattern I had seen before, just louder now. When something hurt me, it was minimized. When I reacted, I became the problem. The focus always shifted away from the action and onto my response. I typed out several replies and deleted them. Explaining myself suddenly felt pointless. The people messaging me weren't confused. They were uncomfortable with the truth. Accepting what happened would have meant questioning their own role in it. I put my phone face down and took a deep breath. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fix the situation. I didn't feel responsible for smoothing things over. I felt tired but also strangely steady. That night forced me to see something clearly. I wasn't leaving because of one bad moment. I was stepping away from a pattern that had been repeating for far too long. The next morning felt strangely quiet. I woke up expecting regret to hit me all at once, but it didn't. Instead, there was a calm heaviness, like my mind had finally stopped fighting itself. I replayed the night again, but this time I didn't focus on what I could have done differently. I focused on what had actually happened. For the first time, I allowed myself to admit that walking away wasn't cruel or dramatic. It was a boundary, one I had avoided setting for years because I didn't want to disappoint anyone. I had been trained, slowly and subtly, to believe that my comfort was optional, that keeping others happy mattered more than my own dignity. Messages kept coming in. Some warned me that I was damaging relationships. Others said I should think long-term and apologize before things became permanent. That word stuck with me, permanent, as if respecting myself was the real threat. I noticed how none of the messages acknowledged my silence as a form of pain. They treated it like defiance, like I owed explanations simply for choosing not to be mistreated. That realization shifted something inside me. I stopped feeling guilty for not responding. I asked myself a simple question. If I went back and apologized, what exactly would I be apologizing for? For noticing disrespect? For refusing to accept humiliation? The answer was uncomfortable but clear. I wasn't sorry for leaving. I was sorry it took something that public for me to finally see the truth. Respect isn't proven in words spoken during a ceremony. It's shown in how someone treats you when no one thinks it matters. That understanding didn't erase the pain, but it gave it meaning. As the days passed, the outside opinions grew louder. People who hadn't been there felt comfortable telling me what I should have done. Some said I needed to be more understanding. Others reminded me that weddings are emotional and messy, that no day ever goes perfectly. A few even suggested that walking out proved I wasn't ready for commitment. What stood out wasn't the advice itself, but how one-sided it was. Everyone spoke about patience, forgiveness, and sacrifice, yet none of it seemed to apply to how I had been treated. The expectation was clear. I was supposed to absorb the humiliation quietly and call it maturity. There were moments when the loneliness hit hard. At night, when distractions faded, doubt tried to creep back in. I wondered if I had overreacted, if leaving had closed doors that could never be reopened. Those thoughts didn't last long, though. Every time they surfaced, I remembered the empty chair, the laughter, the way I had been told to eat later. I realized how dangerous it was to let other people define my limits. Many of the same voices pushing me to apologize had never once checked in on my well-being. Their concern wasn't for me, but for restoring normalcy, for making everything look acceptable again. Choosing to stand firm wasn't easy. It meant sitting with discomfort instead of rushing to fix it. It meant being okay with being misunderstood. But with each day that passed, my resolve grew stronger. I wasn't clinging to anger. I was protecting something more important, my self-respect. For the first time, I wasn't asking for permission to value myself. And even though the path ahead felt uncertain, it finally felt honest. With time, the noise around the situation began to fade. Fewer messages came in. Fewer opinions were offered. The silence gave me space to think without being pulled in different directions. I started reflecting not just on the wedding, but on the relationship as a whole, and patterns became impossible to ignore. I noticed how often my needs had been labeled as inconveniences, how compromise usually meant I adjusted while others stayed comfortable. I had mistaken endurance for strength, believing that staying quiet made me dependable. In reality, it had only made it easier for people to overlook me. What hurt most wasn't the humiliation itself, but the realization that it hadn't shocked anyone else. The behavior that stunned me had felt normal to them. That understanding was painful, but also freeing. It meant the problem wasn't that I had suddenly changed. It was that I had finally stopped accepting what never should have been normal. I stopped imagining alternative endings. I stopped wondering how things might have gone if I had just stayed. The truth was clear. Remaining silent would have required me to betray myself. No relationship built on that kind of sacrifice can survive without resentment. Slowly, I began to feel lighter. Not because everything was resolved, but because I wasn't fighting my own instincts anymore. I trusted myself in a way I hadn't before. That trust became a quiet source of strength. Walking away didn't erase the pain, but it gave me something far more valuable in return: clarity. And clarity, I learned, is often the first step toward real healing. Eventually, I had to make a decision about what came next. Avoiding the conversation forever wasn't realistic, but rushing back into it out of guilt would have been a mistake. I took time to decide what I was willing to accept and what I wasn't. For once, my boundaries weren't flexible. When contact finally happened, it wasn't the dramatic confrontation people imagine. It was quiet, careful, and revealing. The focus was still on how everything had looked, on the embarrassment caused, on the reaction rather than the reason behind it. The lack of accountability said more than any argument ever could. I listened without interrupting. I noticed how quickly responsibility was shifted, how easily the moment itself was minimized. What mattered to me wasn't an apology filled with the right words, but an understanding of why it had hurt. That understanding never came. Instead of anger, I felt a calm certainty. I wasn't being unreasonable. I was being honest about what I needed to feel safe and respected. And if that honesty was too much, then the foundation had never been strong to begin with. Letting go of the future I had imagined was painful. I had invested time, hope, and belief into it. But holding on to something that required me to ignore my own dignity would have been worse. I accepted that some endings don't come with closure everyone agrees on. Sometimes, choosing yourself doesn't look brave from the outside. It looks inconvenient. It looks selfish. But from the inside, it feels like survival. Looking back now, the memory of that day still hurts, but it no longer defines me. What defines me is the choice I made when it mattered most. Walking away wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about refusing to let a moment of public humiliation turn into a lifetime of quiet disrespect. I used to believe that love meant endurance, that staying, no matter how uncomfortable things became, proved commitment. That belief kept me silent far longer than it should have. That day forced me to understand something different. Real partnership doesn't require you to disappear. A wedding is supposed to mark the beginning of mutual respect. When that respect is missing, no amount of tradition, celebration, or pressure can make up for it. I learned that dignity isn't something you negotiate for later. It has to exist from the start. There are still moments when I wonder how things could have been different. But those thoughts don't last, because every time I picture myself sitting back down at that table, pretending everything was fine, I feel the same tightness in my chest, and I know I made the right choice. Leaving didn't solve everything overnight. Healing took time. Trusting myself took time. But choosing myself gave me something I didn't have before. Peace. The kind that comes from knowing you didn't abandon your own values when it counted. Sometimes